Well, good evening, everyone. It looks like it's 6:30 and time for us to get started. My name is Kirby Lambert, and I am with the Outreach and Interpretation Program at the Montana Historical Society. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Mark Johnson, our speaker tonight, who, as you know, or hopefully you know, we are going to be talking about an election, not the election, but another election, 1946 to be exact. So Mark is most pertinently tonight the author of Political Hellraiser, The Life and Times of Senator Burton K. Wheeler, which was published last year. And he came into the Historical Society and did a great talk on an overview of Wheeler's career. And tonight we're delving a little deeper into a specific aspect of that career. Mark has worked as a broadcast journalist, a top aide to Cecil D. Andrus, Idaho's longest serving governor, and a public affairs and crisis communications consultant. He spent nearly 25 years in various capacities with Gallatin Public Affairs, including serving as the firm's president and the longtime managing partner of the Idaho office. He's also the author and speaker for a podcast entitled Many Things Considered. And I guess just in terms of housekeeping, we will be taking questions, but we're going to let Mark finish his talk. And then at the end of the presentation, we will take questions through the Q&A function, and I'll monitor those. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mark. And like I say, when you have questions, just put them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So Mark, thank you very much for doing this for us.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of a Montana Historical Society program again. I really enjoyed my live appearances in Helena a couple of times during 2019, back when I was out on the road talking about Senator Wheeler. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be back with my friends at the Montana Historical Society, and particularly to have an article in the latest issue of Montana, the Magazine of Western History, which in my judgment is among the very best, if not the best, state historical magazine in the United States. It's really terrific, and I'm happy now for the second time to have been published in such a great magazine. So the story I want to tell today is a story about, number one, about political timing. The old saying, Woody Allen saying, 90% of life is showing up. And in politics, maybe 90% of success is picking the right time to make a decision to run for office. And 1946 was certainly a pivotal moment when political timing meant a lot. The story is also about the political acumen of Mike Mansfield, the great Montana senator, who in 1946 was in the House of Representatives and contemplating a run for the Senate. It is also a story about the power of the political attack. This is, of course, pre-social media days, when you didn't have all of this technology and the social media that we have today in terms of carrying out an attack on a political opponent. But as you'll see, some of the attacks in 1946 were able to go viral in any event. It's also a story about how some of the earliest anti-communist hysteria entered the nation's political bloodstream and ultimately became such a feature of American politics in the 1950s and 1960s. So let me set a little context for what was going on in the country in 1946. Of course, World War II had just ended in September of the previous year. It's the famous Japanese surrender scene on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Douglas MacArthur receiving the final surrender of the last Axis power, Japan. The Soviet Union was left in literal possession of much of Eastern Europe, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, was essentially bankrupt. There were worries in France that that country would go to the communists, and a Chinese civil war was underway in China. Of course, GIs were returning home to the workforce, and many thousands were coming back to Montana looking for a return to civilian life, a job, a place to live. Wartime age and price supports were coming off, prices were soaring, and there was a shortage of everything from autos to beefsteak. Automobiles and beefsteak among just many, many things that were still being rationed in 1946. And Harry Truman is in the White House, having succeeded Franklin Roosevelt on Roosevelt's death in April of 1945. And Truman was really struggling in 1946. Look at him, a prominent New Dealer said, and I say to myself, yes, he's in Roosevelt's chair. Yes, he is. Yes, he is. And then I say, oh my God, no, it's not possible. When the president's troubles mounted, the questions about Truman took an even crueler turn. What would Truman do if he were alive, they said. One popular line said, we're just mild about Harry. And another said, to err is Truman. Labor unrest was sweeping the country. There was a nationwide rail strike in May of 1946, and Truman's response to that was to threaten to draft rail workers back into service, which Congress ultimately failed to allow him to do. And all of this would play directly into the election in Montana. But just so you don't think that everything was political in 1946, if you went to the Wilma Theater in Missoula on the weekend before the election in 1946, you could have seen Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall in The Big Sleep. A key player, of course, is this guy, United States Senator Burton K. Wheeler. He's finishing up the last year of his fourth term in the United States Senate in 1946. He's had a long and almost always controversial career. Wheeler, just to remind you, came of age politically in a period of World War I, 1917, 1918, a period of real upheaval in Montana, a time of civil liberties being trampled and dissent being tamped down. He fought back against much of that hysteria and made a name for himself as a civil libertarian. He was an early supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, but split with the president over the direction of the New Deal early on in the 1930s, and particularly broke with Roosevelt over Roosevelt's plan to pack the Supreme Court in 1937. During this period, almost every story about Wheeler made notice of the fact that he was a frequent opponent of President Roosevelt's foreign policy. So he's a controversial guy throughout his entire career. And in 1946, as he faces re-election, he is facing real opposition from within the Montana Democratic Party. This is not a new thing for Wheeler. He's always been a Democrat, but he's a very independent SOB. And a lot of Montana Democrats had soured on Wheeler by his time in 1946. Part of the opposition to Wheeler stemmed from the Democratic anger over a powerful bipartisan political machine that Wheeler had developed, along with the Republican governor of Montana at the time, Sam Ford. Ford had been elected governor in 1940, reelected in 1944, with Wheeler's quiet support. Ford had actually worked for Wheeler in the U.S. Attorney's Office back during World War I, and they had long been personal and political allies. The third member of the Wheeler-Ford Rankin machine was Wellington Rankin, a very wealthy Montana landowner, rancher, lawyer, and the brother of the celebrated Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin. Wellington Rankin is a progressive Republican of the old school, and he has known Wheeler for years. And they all make common cause to essentially, from about 1938 until 1946, really dominate Montana politics on a bipartisan basis. A couple of Wheeler's top lieutenants are installed in important jobs in the Ford administration. They all kind of check signals. Wellington Rankin runs for the United States Senate as a Republican in 1942 with Wheeler's tacit support. He loses barely against this guy, Jim Murray, who is a Democrat like Wheeler, but that's about the only commonality between the two men. By the late 1930s, they have an unhealthy, I would say, disregard for each other. There's an old saying in politics that the most complicated relationship in politics is between two members of the Senate from the same state. And Wheeler and Murray were always at each other's throats in various ways. Both men were from Butte. Both considered themselves liberal Democrats, but they really hardly ever were on the same page together. And it particularly had a falling out in 1942 when Wellington Rankin, Wheeler's friend, runs against Murray and only loses by about 1,200 votes. So both Wheeler and Murray at this point are vying for dominance in the Montana Democratic Party. The other player who really starts to emerge on the scene in 1946 is this guy, Mike Mansfield, a real up-and-comer, first elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1942. He's an academic, a history professor with a real interest in Asian history. He had spent some of his formative years in Butte working in the copper mines, some of the most difficult kind of work as a mucker, the guy who shovels the ore into the ore carts. He gets married. His wife, Maureen, insists that he go back to school and get a degree. He's elected to Congress in 1942, still very junior status still by 1946. But he comes to the attention of this guy, Franklin Roosevelt, seen here on one of his trips in the 1930s to Montana. And Roosevelt takes an interest in Mansfield's career. In fact, he set out, in my judgment, to groom Mansfield, so to speak, to be the Democratic challenger against Wheeler in that 1946 Democratic primary. Mansfield wins re-election in 1944 to his House seat, and almost immediately after that election, he leaves on a presidential fact-finding trip to the Far East, visiting India, Burma, and China. He is designated an official representative of the President of the United States to undertake this fact-finding mission. And he's a very junior member of the House of Representatives. But this trip really serves to advance his political prospects in Montana, to raise his national profile. He reaps a whirlwind of PR from this trip. You're looking at a picture here of Mansfield in Burma in early in 1945. He's meeting with a group of Montana GIs that are in Burma. He makes sure that pictures are taken every time he meets somebody from Montana. Those pictures are sent back to their local newspaper and their families. So it's a real PR coup that Mansfield gets to take this trip at the behest of the President of the United States. In fact, Mansfield's biographer, Don Oberndorfer, called it the most significant event of Mansfield's career in the House of Representatives. And again, why did FDR do this? Well, he is clearly trying to prepare Mansfield for a challenge against B.K. Wheeler in 1946. As I said, the trip was a PR coup, headlines like this in Montana newspapers. Mansfield meeting a soldier from Chester. He gets lots of press coverage. He speaks to a joint session of the Montana legislature. He gives an hour-long talk to the House of Representatives in Washington about his findings and presents his report in an extensive document to the President of the United States. So it's a real PR coup. He goes far afield from his legislative district, speaking as far away as Miles City in far eastern Montana, speaking about his observations. So Mansfield, in one fell swoop, really enhances his standing in Montana politics. This guy plays into this story as well, Jim Rowe. He is a top advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. He grew up in Butte, went off to Harvard Law School, and became one of the early brain trusters in the Roosevelt administration during the early days of the New Deal. Holds a number of jobs in various federal agencies, but continues to be very involved in Montana politics, knows all the key players, and he is advising Roosevelt that this Mike Mansfield guy is a real up-and-comer. And, if we were to give him a presidential assignment, which he already knows a good deal about, Asia, it could really help his standing in Montana. At one point in 1944, Jim Rowe sends a memorandum to President Roosevelt where he says, Mike Mansfield is a real up-and-comer. He has a good relationship with the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. I think he has a real future in Democratic politics. He's a good New Dealer. He has the right kind of profile of being a copper miner and also an academic. And he sends the president a little straw poll that has been conducted by the Great Falls Tribune, which shows that Wheeler's standing among Montana Democrats has really suffered in large part because of his persistent criticism of Roosevelt's foreign policy. So Jim Rowe, very impressive guy in his own right, goes on to a long career in Washington, D.C. as an advisor to presidents and members of Congress, very close to Lyndon Johnson, manages Lyndon Johnson's presidential campaign in 1960. But he's a Montana guy keeping an eye on Montana politics in the late 1940s. Mansfield's getting a lot of encouragement to run for the Senate against B.K. Wheeler. Typical is a letter he gets from Merle Burlingame, who's a prominent historian at Montana State University, saying to Mansfield, I've long supported Wheeler, but I think it's time to get rid of him, and you're the guy who can do it. Mansfield receives similar letters from all over the state, from labor union organizers, Democratic Party officials. We know how carefully Mansfield is evaluating his run against Wheeler because he kept all these notes that he made. All of the correspondence is in his archive at the University of Montana in Missoula. And it shows a real strong sense that Mansfield is getting a huge amount of encouragement from Democrats to take on this iconic Democratic senator. But he's playing it very cagey, keeping all of his options open, saying that he has nothing to say. This is in February of 1946, about the fact that he might take on Senator Wheeler. But at the same time that he is saying, he's being very cagey about it, he's also working the telephone lines and talking to people all over the state about what his prospects might be. One of the calls he makes is to the chairman of the Montana Democratic Party. This is late February 1946. He asks, and again, we know this because he kept notes of the conversation, what are my chances if I have the field myself to Wheeler? Lester Lobel, the chairman of the Democratic Party in Montana, says, very good. Mansfield wants to know if he'll have financial support if he wants to make the run. And Lobel assures him that, yes, in fact, he will have financial support. Lobel was so enthused by this call that he has with Mansfield that the very same day that he visits with Mansfield on the telephone, he writes a letter to him saying how delighted I am that you're going to make this race against Senator Wheeler. you can count on the support of so many Roosevelt Democrats in Montana if you're willing to make this run. Drew Pearson, the syndicated columnist, actually has an item in a column in February 1946, absolutely certain that Mike Mansfield of Montana will run against Democratic Senator Burt Wheeler. The latter faces the fight of his life, says Drew Pearson. While Mansfield is assessing his options and looking at the chances that he might be able to beat Wheeler, the other contenders on the Democratic side are kind of frozen in place, including this guy, Leif Eriksen. Eriksen had been the Democratic Party candidate for governor in 1944, had been a member of the state Supreme Court, and clearly is a Democratic up-and-comer. And if Mansfield is not going to run against Wheeler, Leif Eriksen very much wants to run against him. Eriksen grew up in eastern Montana in the Sydney area, went off to college at the University of Chicago. You can see he's kind of a brawny, beefy guy. He's a Big Ten conference heavyweight wrestling champion while he's in college, comes back to Montana, practices law, and again starts maneuvering up the political ladder. Unsuccessful candidate for governor in 1944, but he's thirsting to make another statewide race, and he very much has got his eye on the Senate race as well. At one point, Eriksen calls Mike Mansfield, trying to find out if Mansfield really is going to make this race. And this is in, again, a late February 1946. They have a lengthy telephone call, and again, Mansfield kept notes of the call. Eriksen tells him at one point, you know, I think Wheeler can only be defeated if somebody runs a real fighting campaign against him. Well, we might read that terminology as being a real negative or attack campaign against him. Eriksen presses Mansfield for a decision. And frankly, he says to Mansfield, because I believe this attacking campaign is the only way to defeat him, I wonder if you really are up to that kind of a campaign. And Mansfield promises him that he will let him know very soon whether he's going to make the race or not. Wheeler can only be beaten by a slugging campaign, Eriksen says. Early March 1946, Mansfield issues a terse statement to the press. He is not going to run for the Senate. He will seek his seat again in the House of Representatives for the Western District of Montana. Mansfield's announcement, as the newspapers say, is interpreted as putting to rest to reports that he might seek the Senate seat of fellow Democrat Burton K. Wheeler. So Mansfield declines to run. I asked him, when I was working on my book on Senator Wheeler, I had the opportunity to visit with him in Washington, D.C., and I asked him about all of this evaluation that he had done of the campaign in 1946, and then suddenly, even despite all the assurances that he'd have widespread Democratic support, he decides not to run. And I said, Senator, why, after all that work, did you decide not to make the race? And typical Mansfield, very terse response. He says, didn't think I could win. And I've thought a lot about that since. I think it's entirely possible that Mike Mansfield could have won the Democratic primary in 1946, but because he's an astute political observer and operative, he looked at the general election and may have decided that 1946 was going to be what it turned out to be, a huge Republican year, and he might well not have been able to prevail in the general election. But he decides, for whatever reason, that he is not going to run for the Senate in 1946. And Leif Eriksen immediately gets into the race. He goes immediately after Wheeler as not being sufficiently supportive of the National Democratic Party, charges that Wheeler has let veterans down. He's been wrong about foreign policy. He's wrong on the proposed Missouri Valley Authority project, a big river basin planning and development project that was proposed for Montana and the Missouri Valley that was modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority. Wheeler is opposed to it. Erickson is in favor of it. So he really comes out both fists flailing at Wheeler, attacking him on several different fronts. And there are lots of other things going on here as well. There's what we might today call an independent expenditure campaign that's being run by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, part of the American labor movement in the 1940s. The AFL and the CIO have not yet merged. So the CIO has its own political action committee, which is opposed to Wheeler, even though he's long supported organized labor and has long enjoyed the support of organized labor. The union throws its support behind Erikson. And there's what one observer has called the dynamiting of Wheeler. Mailings, tabloid newspapers, postcards, and one particularly scandalous book. The book was called The Plot Against America, Senator Wheeler and the Forces Behind Him. This comes out early in 1946. It is a salacious book, to say the least, full of innuendo, wild accusations, a kind of conspiracy theory encyclopedia for 1946 Montana, a Montana QAnon almost. The book is filled with composite illustrations of Wheeler, ogling dance hall girls. Just take a look at the table of contents. Gives you some idea about the kind of book it is. The overriding message, which is carried in tabloid newspapers that are printed and distributed across Montana, in flyers that are sent to people's mailboxes, is that Wheeler is hoping to become the dictator of Montana. He's going to bring a fascist regime to Montana, and that he is essentially a crook, and has been since the beginning of his political career. Here's one cartoon from the book where Wheeler seems to be talking to the Anaconda Company, both of them wearing swastikas. So The Plot Against America is out there. You can still find the book online, used bookstores, various places. And of course, it is this exact same title of Phillips Roth's acclaimed historical novel, and I put historical in quotation marks because he used, frankly, he used a lot of the allegations contained in the attacks on Wheeler in 1946 to kind of justify his book about what happens if America becomes subject to a fascist dictator. And his dictator, of course, is Charles Lindbergh, and Lindbergh's vice president is Burton K. Wheeler in Philip Roth's book. I think it's interesting that Roth never acknowledged the existence of the original plot against America when he wrote this book some years ago, which again has been widely acclaimed as great fiction because it is fiction. Wheeler initially takes with a grain of salt these attacks that are being thrown at him, but as the primary election in July of 1946 comes closer, he realizes that he may be on the verge of losing. And he demands of the United States Senate that they conduct an investigation of who paid for this book, where all of this money is coming from, and who's behind it. Senate committee is actually convened. They have hearings in Helena right before the primary election in 1946. Take sworn testimony from a number of people who testify before the committee, including a fellow by the name of John E. Kennedy, who lived in Missoula and was listed as the publisher of the book. Kennedy has a close relationship with another Wheeler foe, Jerry O'Connell, a former Montana congressman who was at odds with Wheeler on almost everything in the 1930s. And Kennedy admits that, yes, I arranged to have the book published. I hired the guy who wrote the book. And he produces a fellow by the name of Gehring, from another Missoula guy, who is a coffee shop operator in a hotel, has a coffee shop in a hotel in Missoula, who says he invested $8,500 in the book as an investment opportunity. I did quite a bit of investigation of the source of the money behind this book when I wrote about Senator Wheeler, and I was not able to ascertain with any certainty who paid for the publication of the book. I'm almost certain it wasn't J.W. Gehring Jr. He was claiming that, among other things, that he was grossing $20,000 a month from his coffee shop in Missoula, and I suspect that the return on investment for a Starbucks would be happy to have that kind of return on investment. So the story just doesn't add up. Somebody obviously set out to smear Senator Wheeler with this salacious book, and the Senate committee that investigated it was unable to come to a conclusion about who was really behind it. They finally concluded that it was not Leif Eriksen. Eriksen had nothing to do with the publication of the book, but it's still unclear who actually financed the hit piece on Wheeler. Joseph Kinsey Howard, the great Montana writer, concluded that the book had defamed Wheeler, and he called it the worst type of political propaganda, sheer distortion of facts, to put it mildly. So the Senate committee ultimately did issue a report on all of this and concluded that Wheeler had been the subject of a vicious smear campaign, perhaps one of the most vicious in the history of the United States Senate. Here's Gehring being asked during his testimony, do you consider yourself as an investor or as a sucker? Gehring says, that's a question I don't think I could quite answer yet. Right about the same time that the Senate is investigating this salacious book, Harry Truman wades into the Montana Senate race. He writes a letter that is actually unveiled during the Senate testimony, where he basically endorses Wheeler. He said early on in 1946 that he would stay out of inter-party politics, but he issued a letter saying that he felt that he had to speak up for Senator Wheeler because of these vicious attacks that were being launched against him, including the attack that he suddenly had turned his back on organized labor, and particularly the rail unions, which are incredibly important in Montana in this period. 3 transcontinental railroads going across Montana in the 1930s and 40s. Wheeler had always enjoyed support from the rail unions, but by 1946, he was losing that support. In fact, one of my suppositions is that maybe the Brotherhood of Railway Engineers actually financed this book, although I haven't been able to prove that. So Harry Truman wades into the election, probably doing Wheeler more harm than good because of his unpopularity at this point. And sure enough, Wheeler loses renomination to Leif Erikson after 24 years in the Senate by about 6,000 votes statewide. And the Republican Party picks a fellow by the name of Zales Ecton to be their candidate in the general election against Erikson in November of 1946. Again, Joseph Kinsey Howard has a great description of what happens to Wheeler. He said, Senator Wheeler fell between 2 stools, which were yanked out from under him just when he thought he had securely anchored them, and while he was busily attempting to convert them into a bench. He was convinced that he was bigger than any one party, big enough for 2. So what he's really saying is that his metaphor is the two stools are the Republican and Democratic parties. Wheeler has bridged the Republican and Democratic parties with a plank, a bench. but it all collapses on him in the Democratic primary in 1946. So here are the two guys who slugged it out in the Democratic primary. Wheeler makes a classic mistake in his effort to get renominated. He picks a fight with people who are not on the ballot. He should have been concentrating his fire on Leif Eriksen, this up and coming young politician, but he's battling against the CIO PAC. He's railing against the outside money that's coming into Montana. He at one point gets into a back and forth with James Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's son, who is attacking Wheeler and supporting Erickson. So he's fighting with people not on the ballot. He should have concentrated his fire on Erickson, but by the time he actually does take on Erickson, literally on the eve of the election, it's too late. The epitaph or the obituaries, if you will, the political obituaries for Wheeler note that, you know, he's been a power in Washington, D.C. since he first arrived in 1923, leading the effort to stop Roosevelt's court packing, an adroit legislative parliamentarian, a statesman of great courage and vision, but he loses. Zales Ecton is the Republican candidate in 1946. He's a rancher from Gallatin County, had served in the state legislature in both houses, had been chairman of the Montana Republican Party, and in 1946 he captures the Republican nomination for the Senate. And almost immediately he goes on the attack against Leif Erikson as being a left-wing Democrat. He says, Ecton says Erikson should repudiate the endorsement of the CIO PAC because the CIO, he alleges, is infiltrated by communists. And headlines like this are not uncommon, where he accuses essentially his Democratic opponent of being sympathetic to the Soviet Union, accepting Moscow's blessing in the election. Here's one of the ads that runs very late in the campaign. An urgent need to halt the march toward the socialization of industry, stifling of private enterprise, further government control of agriculture, the regimentation of labor, the infringement of the federal government upon state laws. So, you know, Republican attack against a drift towards socialism, which I hardly need to point out is still an attack line of the National Republican Party today. One of the last ads Ecton runs in the campaign simply says, "Had enough, time for real change." Mansfield, meanwhile, is running for re-election to his own House seat in the Western District of Montana, and he comes under attack for being, in essence, a left-wing socialist communist sympathizer. Ads like this appear in newspapers in Mansfield's district. Will you string along with Uncle Joe, meaning Joe Stalin, or will you vote American? So, stark choice, as Republicans and conservatives are portraying it, between voting for a Republican conservative or a Democratic liberal who is going to be sympathetic to communism. And Ecton wins. He becomes the first popularly elected Republican senator in Montana history in 1946, beating Leif Erikson quite handily. He carries 44 of the 56 Montana counties, a comfortable election, in an election that is a huge sweep for the National Republican Party. For the first time since the 20s, Republicans can gain control of the House of Representatives. They win control of the Senate. 13 different Senate seats switch hands in 1946, including, of course, the Montana seat. Somehow, against these odds, Mansfield barely wins re-election in his congressional district in western Montana. So his timing seems to me to have been exquisite. He decides to forego a Senate election in 1946, possibly knowing that he could win the Democratic primary, but that he might well face impossible odds in the general election. So he preserves his options to run again another day for the United States Senate. Another young fellow who makes an appearance in a big way on the Montana scene in 1946 is Leif Metcalf, who wins a seat on the Montana Supreme Court, later goes on to become a congressman, of course, and a United States senator for 3 terms in Montana. Eriksen goes to the Senate, almost immediately becomes a voice of the anti-communist right in the Senate. He attacks the Truman administration for believing that it can do business with the communists. He attacks the Truman administration for its handling of the war in Korea. He becomes one of the most outspoken members of the Senate on this threat that the United States is drifting in the direction of socialism in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He says one of the reasons that he needs to be returned to the Senate is that he has helped be a check on the wild schemes of Democrats that would socialize medicine, create these valley authorities, et cetera, et cetera. By 1952, Mansfield is ready to try for the Senate. And of course, he has to beat the guy who has won the seat just 4 years earlier. Eriksen is not got much of a record to run on in 1952. He is pretty much defined by his anti-communism, by his support for Joseph McCarthy in the Senate. McCarthy, of course, makes a celebrated speech in 1950 where he accuses the Truman administration of tolerating communists at the State Department without a shred of proof. But the story literally goes viral and is picked up by a number of Republican politicians, including Zales Eriksen. And McCarthy actually comes to Montana to campaign for Eriksen in 1952 against Mike Mansfield. McCarthy stops short of actually calling Mansfield a communist, but he comes awfully close, saying that Mansfield's presidential envoy trip that we mentioned earlier in 1945 was favorably noted in the Daily Worker, the daily newspaper of the Communist Party USA. McCarthy emphasized he was not accusing Mansfield of being a communist, but he was awfully stupid or perhaps a dupe of the communists. Very, very bitter election in 1952 between Eriksen and Mansfield. Mansfield wins. I think largely on the basis of a last-minute radio appeal that he made, where he, in essence, said, people in Montana know me. They know my record. These scurrilous attacks against me are unfair, un-American. They're questioning my patriotism. I served in the military. He'd actually served in 3 different branches of the military as a young man. He is a loyal American. And on the strength of that last-minute appeal, I think he is able to turn back the tide and defeat Zales Eriksen in 1952. So just to sum up, the 2 central characters in 1946, Burton K. Wheeler and Mike Mansfield, are broadly remembered in Montana and across the country today. Mansfield, of course, featured in a handsome statue along with his wife Maureen in the Montana Capitol building in Helena, and a bust of Senator Wheeler in the rotunda of the Capitol building. So these guys are remembered. The so-called winners of 1952, mostly forgotten, Zales Ecton and Leif Eriksen. Ecton dies in 1961, and Mansfield, by this time, is the Senate Majority Leader, and he gives a nice tribute to Ecton on the floor of the Senate, calling him a decent man and praising his service to the country. Ecton's one term ends in 1952. Leif Erikson lives to a ripe old age of 92, dying finally in 1998. He tries to resurrect his political career with another run for governor, but falls short. Still stays involved in Democratic politics in Montana and served for a time on the Montana Historical Society board. Again, Erikson died in 1998. And most Montanans will know that Mike Mansfield went on to an absolutely stellar career in the United States Senate. Here he is in 1961 with Vice President Johnson, President Kennedy, Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, and Mansfield as the Senate Majority Leader. He served as the Majority Leader for 16 years, longer than anybody has ever served in that position. Here he is with Everett Dirksen, his Republican counterpart in the Senate, with President Johnson. Johnson doing all the talking, not surprisingly. Dirksen trying to get a word in edgewise. Mansfield in a typical pose, listening. Mansfield became Majority Leader in 1961 when Johnson became Vice President. Truly remarkable career in the Senate. But I think it's worth contemplating the counterfactual about 1946. Suppose Mansfield would have run and defeated Wheeler, perhaps, and then lost the general election in 1946. He might never have made it to the Senate. His political career, for all practical purposes, might well have ended in 1946. But timing being what it is, and him being an astute political operative, he kept open all of his options and was able to seize the moment in 1952 and go on to a stellar career in the Senate. I noted recently that Mitch McConnell, the current Senate Majority Leader, was taking a little bit of a victory lap when the Senate confirmed the latest justice of the Supreme Court, essentially bragging that no Senate Majority Leader in history, even Lyndon Johnson, when he was Majority Leader, could match the record of McConnell. Well, maybe that's correct in terms of confirming Supreme Court justices, but in terms of legislative accomplishments, there is no greater Senate record than the one Mike Mansfield accumulated. Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Wilderness Act, a bevy of great society programs from higher education to creation of the public broadcasting system. All of that happened under Mike Mansfield. He was also the architect of the Watergate investigation, the architect of Frank Church's investigation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Mike Mansfield truly was the greatest Majority Leader in the Senate's history. So in the state's incredibly colorful political history, 1946 really stands out as one of the more colorful chapters in that long history. And since there's the characters we've met, Burton K. Wheeler, Leif Erikson, Zales Ecton, and of course, Mike Mansfield. And since there's no promotion like self-promotion, I have to put in a plug for my forthcoming book. I got a new book coming out in February 2021, more Senate history about 1980, the election of 1980, which not unlike 1946, saw Republicans gain control of the United States Senate for the first time in many, many years, and the defeat of a number of Democratic incumbents. It also was the rise of the independent expenditure campaign in American politics, something that has now become an absolute fixture in our politics. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this chapter in Montana political history. I've really enjoyed it. I'd be delighted to try to respond to any questions if you have any.
Hey, Mark, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that was great. Very, very much enjoyed that presentation, and I will get to the questions.
Great.
The first question from Brad. This is a fascinating talk. Thanks, Mark. Do you know if the stress on communism in the 46th Montana Senate election and in Mansfield's race for the Western District House seat represented one of the first campaigns to stress communism in what became the Second Red Scare?
Great question, and the answer is yes. I believe it is one of the first. You might remember that a fellow by the name of Richard Nixon was also running in 1946, a famous race in California, where he made much of labeling his opponent as a communist sympathizer or a dupe, a leftist. But surely the extent to which the allegations were made by Ecton and the Republican Party in general, and related groups that were helping them with the election of 1946, would mark Montana's election that year as one of the very first where this sort of virulent anti-communism became a real fixture of American politics. And of course, Ecton goes on to become a real acolyte of Joseph McCarthy, a strong supporter of McCarthy in the Senate. And most Republicans were, frankly, strong supporters of McCarthy until such time that he really overstepped his bounds. But that was not until 1954. Ecton was out of the Senate by that time. Mansfield and Jim Murray are in the Senate representing Montana. Both of them, of course, voted to censure McCarthy when the Senate finally got around to doing that in 1954. But yeah, 1946 was kind of the tip of the spear in terms of this tactic being widely employed by conservatives against liberals.
Another question. Do you think there's anyone in the Senate like Mansfield today?
Anyone in the Senate like Mike Mansfield today? Short answer is no. I think there's a curious thing has happened with Mansfield's legacy. Almost everyone celebrates it, no one emulates it. People from as diverse perspectives on the political spectrum as former Senator Tom Daschle from South Dakota and former Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi, who were at various times leaders of their parties in the Senate in more recent times, have been quoted as saying that Mansfield's Senate was the glory days of the Senate, when bipartisanship really ruled, when working across the aisle was not at all considered abnormal or out of the ordinary, that Mansfield had created an environment in the Senate where every one of 100 senators was considered an equal to everyone else. Everybody was treated with utmost fairness. The committee systems were allowed to work. This is not to say that the Senate of the 1960s and 70s was perfect. It was far from perfect, and there was plenty of partisanship. But the kind of leadership and the style of leadership that Mansfield brought to the Senate is sadly celebrated, but not emulated. And frankly, one of the reasons, in my judgment, why the Senate has ceased to work as it once did, as a deliberative body where consensus finally comes about on important national issues like civil rights in 1964 and 65, which Mansfield, of course, had his hands and fingerprints all over. The reason that that doesn't happen is because the partisanship has trumped the institution of the Senate as a place where people come to solve the nation's problems. I'm actually trying to work on a new book about this portion of the story. Mansfield is such a fascinating character to study and to write about that I'm hoping to do something on the Senate of the 1960s when he was the majority leader. Everett Dirksen of Illinois was the minority leader. Two guys that couldn't have been more different in terms of their political ideology, but they had an enormous amount of respect and genuine affection for each other that shows up in their correspondence and their comments to each other. It's an entirely different time in the Senate.
So, Mark, do you feel that Mansfield could be elected in Montana today?
Could Mike Mansfield be elected today? Well, that's a really good question. I think he would be shocked and probably appalled by the amount of money and the outside attention that is paid in every United States Senate race these days. He typically spent a few $1,000s on his reelection campaign. It was not uncommon for him to take money that was donated to his reelection campaign and give it to other candidates who were, further down the ticket. After 1952, he really never had a seriously contested election. He was enormously popular, enormously able to connect with people. My friend Rob Saldine, who teaches at the University of Montana, a great political scientist, says, to be successful in Montana politics, and I believe this is absolutely true, Rob says you have to first prove to Montana voters that you are authentic, that you belong in this place. And Mansfield never, ever had to cross that authentic boundary. He was the authentic Montana. And so I think, yeah, he probably could have been. It would be a totally different environment. He would have run a very different kind of campaign than we see these days. He wouldn't have been on television very much, I suspect. He would have been in coffee shops and county fairs back when you could do that in the pre-COVID era. But he ran a very different kind of campaign. Pat Williams, former congressman from Western Montana, who held the seat that Mike Mansfield held in the House for many years, used to say that Mike would come to town and he'd go to a local coffee shop and order a cup of coffee and just sit there and talk to whoever came up and wanted to visit. And word got around that Mike Mansfield was in town. So it's a totally different era and a totally different kind of politics than we see practiced now in this, really contentious campaign that's going on in Montana right now.
So have you met with any skepticism or resistance to your portrayals of Wheeler? And if so, what were the most common points on which people have differed with you?
Yeah, a little bit. The common, a common belief somewhat in the academic world is that Wheeler was much more of a fascist sympathizer of Nazi Germany than I believe he was. There is some belief that, he went the extra mile with his involvement with the America First Committee prior to Pearl Harbor to basically be a channel for Nazi or fascist propaganda in the United States. To some degree, I would acknowledge that's true. He often had a take on issues of the day, or at least Roosevelt's foreign policy, that mirrored the rhetoric that was coming out of the German embassy, for example. But was he a fascist, a Nazi sympathizer? I don't believe so. But that's probably the area that is still the most controversial about his career. Just how far did he go in terms of subverting American foreign policy at a time when Franklin Roosevelt was trying to pull the country together to resist, Nazi domination of Europe. Let's be frank about it. So, and I say in my book about Wheeler that the best that you can say about his foreign policy was that he was enormously consistent throughout his life about the United States not being well served by intervening in all the world's problems. And I think that's demonstrably true. But you could also say that he was slow to recognize the immense danger presented by Nazi Germany. And had Wheeler's foreign policy sort of played itself out, as opposed to Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy, you might very well have seen Western Europe dominated by a Nazi fascist government for years and years into the 20th century. So his reluctance to aid Great Britain when the United Kingdom was fighting alone against Nazi Germany was is an indictment of his perhaps lack of nuanced understanding of what was happening in the world. He took a very black and white view of American foreign policy and believed that the United States was secure within its continental boundaries, had two big oceans on either side of it, that it did not have to worry about becoming involved in these exotic conflicts in faraway places in the world. But even by 1940, the world is becoming a much smaller place, and what's happening in Western Europe and in Asia is of great interest and great importance to the United States. So that remains the rub with Wheeler's career, and where there is still, frankly, room for debate about his legacy in that regard.
So is there a biography about Mansfield that you would recommend?
There is an excellent biography of Mike Mansfield. It was written by a fellow by the name of Don Obendorfer, a longtime reporter for the Washington Post, who fortunately is no longer with us, a great reporter. And he based his biography of Mansfield on, obviously, archival research into Mansfield's papers, which are, as I mentioned, voluminous at the University of Montana in Missoula. But he also was able to convince Mansfield to sit for hours and hours of interviews. And he based his book on these really detailed conversations with Mansfield about, his attitudes about Vietnam, about Lyndon Johnson, Watergate, the intelligence agencies. Again, think about Mansfield's tenure as majority leader. You had the Watergate investigation while he's majority leader. You had the Church investigation of the intelligence agencies while he's majority leader. And he put together, you could argue, he put together every one of those efforts and put the right person, in the case of Sam Ervin or Frank Church, in charge of those investigations. So Obendorfer's book is by far the best. There's another book by one of Mansfield's longtime aides, Francis Vallejo, that is also quite good. It's more of an intimate portrayal of Mansfield and his leadership style in the Senate, but it's quite good as well.
Are there any Wheeler relatives around?
Oh yeah, in fact, I think there might be a couple on this participating in this event tonight. There's an extended Wheeler family, great-grandchildren, grandchildren, all of the Senator and Mrs. Wheeler's direct relations. Their children are no longer living, but there are lots of Wheeler relatives around for sure.
Great.
And I thank them all for buying the book.
Susan Wheeler raised her hand as in response to that.
Yes. Hi, Susan.
So
Brad Snow is a great friend of mine, lives down in Livingston, teaches at Montana State University. He's a great grandson of Senator Wheeler. So there's a lot of Wheeler connections around, and still some up at Glacier Park, where, of course, the Senator and Mrs. Wheeler had a cabin for many, many years.
see. So what drew you to to write this biography of Wheeler?
Well, I was drawn to Wheeler for the same reason I guess I'm drawn to Mansfield, a fascinating character, an individual, independent as all get out, stubborn and opinionated, never at a loss for an opinion, somebody who was colorful, got involved in all kinds of scrapes and scraps during his career. But I was drawn to his independence. I was drawn to his commitment to civil liberties. I was drawn to the fact that he had the kind of bipartisan relationships that frankly do not exist in politics anymore. He openly campaigned and endorsed Republicans that he liked for offices, including the United States Senate. So he's just a fascinating character, and played an outsized role in American politics, frankly, from the 20s to the 40s. Hard to think of too many other people who had as many irons in the fire, so to speak, politically as Wheeler did, from literally the moment he arrived in the Senate in 1923 until he left after his defeat in 1946. He was involved in everything from energy, electric utility regulation to the creation of the Federal Communications Commission, oversight of telecommunications policy, very involved in foreign policy, although he never served on the Foreign Relations Committee, but he was very involved in foreign policy in the 1930s and 1940s, very active in presidential campaigns for Roosevelt in 1932 and again in 1936, very close to Harry Truman. I think one of the reasons that Truman finally endorsed Wheeler in 1946 is that they had such a close personal relationship. Didn't agree on a lot of things, including Wheeler disagreeing with Truman's foreign policy in many respects, but they had a genuine regard and affection for each other. Truman used to say that when he came to the Senate for the first time in 1934 as a very young Green politician from Missouri, that only one senator had befriended him, attempted to show him the ropes and help him out, and that was Burton K. Wheeler. So he's just a fascinating character and involved in everything from Frank Little's murder in Butte in 1917 to a controversial investigation of the motion picture industry in 1941 to this crazy campaign in 1946.
So how did Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield deal with the Southern Democrats, all of whom signed the Southern Manifesto supporting segregation, to get the Senate to pass civil rights legislation?
That is a great question. How did Mansfield deal with these Southern barons of the Senate, many of whom were extremely important committee chairmen, people like Big Jim Eastland from Mississippi, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Richard Russell from Georgia, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee in this period. Not quite as adamant a segregationist, but still very much a Southerner, J. William Fulbright from Arkansas, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. How did Mansfield navigate through the Senate with these really very conservative Democrats holding so much power and influence? Well, number one, he let them do their work. He very much believed that the committee system in the Senate had to be allowed to operate, and that the committee system would produce legislation or not based upon the working of how you draft legislation. You have hearings, you take testimony from expert witnesses, you hear different points of view. And from that process, which is messy and time consuming and often not very satisfactory if you want quick answers, you get to solutions. So in the case of the most famous piece of legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Mansfield made the decision early on, and he went to Richard Russell, the leader of the Southern Barons, the leader of the segregationist Southern Democrats, And he told Dick Russell, he said, we're going to debate this bill on the floor of the Senate, and you're going to have to be there and defend it, defend your position. And we're going to debate it, and we're going to see if we can't beat you that way. So the longest filibuster in Senate history takes place in 1964. And through a process of sheer attrition, Mansfield and Everett Dirksen, his partner on the Republican side, wear down these Southern Democrats. And they finally get a vote to bring the bill to final vote, a vote on cloture, which got more than the required 2/3 vote. And it was just Mansfield letting the process work. He specifically refused to do something that Lyndon Johnson had been known for during his time as majority leader. Johnson would often keep the Senate in session round the clock. And you've seen some of these pictures perhaps of senators sleeping on cots in the cloakroom so that they could, respond to a quorum call in the middle of the night. Mansfield said, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep relatively regular hours, but we're going to debate this bill as long as it takes to get to what he needed 67 votes to cut off debate at that time. And he wound up getting 71 votes when it finally came to closure, with lots and lots of help from Everett Dirksen. Would not have happened without Dirksen. And one of the ways that Mansfield dealt with those Southern Democrats was to get Dirksen's help to bring Republican votes where he needed them in order to pass that landmark civil rights bill in 1964. So the way he dealt with the Southern Democrats was to understand their prerogatives as powerful chairman, to let them be the heads of their fiefdoms, if you will. But in the end of the day, he outsmarted them and he wore them down and he beat them.
Can you tell us more about Jim Rowe and his long relationship with Mansfield?
Well, Jim Rowe is a fascinating guy. I think there's actually it would be actually a great book in his life story. I mentioned earlier, he grew up in Butte, went away as a young man to Harvard, got a very good education, wound up being a clerk for the Supreme Court justice, went to work still quite at an early young age in the Roosevelt administration in the early 1930s. Became an absolute indispensable confidant of Franklin Roosevelt, still kept his ties to Montana, knew all the Montana political figures. There's a clipping or two in Roosevelt's papers at the Presidential Library at Hyde Park, New York, where Jim Rowe would attach a little note to a newspaper clipping from a Montana paper and send it into the president saying, you'll be interested in this. I remember distinctly one of the clippings was a straw poll that had been conducted, I believe, by the Great Falls Tribune about whether people who had supported Wheeler in 1940 in his reelection would support him in 1946. And the straw poll, not scientific, but a straw poll indicated that many people had misgivings about supporting Wheeler. So Rowe sends that in to Roosevelt saying, you'll be interested in this. He described himself as a, actually I wrote the term down. What did he call himself? He called himself a bird dogger. He called himself a bird dogger for Roosevelt. He did whatever Roosevelt needed done, he said. He became enormously well connected on Capitol Hill, became close friends with then Speaker Sam Rayburn, and then later with Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. He managed Lyndon Johnson's presidential campaign in 1960, advised every Democratic president from Roosevelt to Jimmy Carter, I guess. A tremendously interesting guy, by all accounts, had a terrific sense of humor, very, very politically savvy. One of the stories is that in 1948, when Truman is running for re-election and everyone believes that he is destined to go down in a disastrous landslide, And Truman pulls that election out in one of the great presidential comebacks in presidential history, maybe the greatest. Jim Rowe was an architect of a lot of the strategy that Truman used Clark Clifford gets credit in the history books for drafting the memo to Truman that laid out the strategy for how he fights back and makes the campaign a referendum on Republicans instead of on himself. But it was really Jim Rowe who was the architect of a lot of that. So absolutely a fascinating guy. In 1940, what would it be, 48, when Lyndon Johnson is running for the Senate for the first time successfully and wins the election in Texas by 87 votes. Jim Rowe was part of the legal team along with Abe Fortas that saw to it that Johnson's 87 vote margin stayed in place and held up during various appeals after the election in 1948. So guy had his fingerprints on all kinds of things from the 30s to the 70s. Fascinating guy from Butte, Montana.
So in addition to Mrs. Wheeler, please identify Senator Wheeler's most influential advisors.
Senator Wheeler, well, his most influential advisor, I would argue, was Lulu, Mrs. Wheeler. She was a political confidant, strategist, cheerleader, critic, gadfly for him. They were very, very close. Had I think, an enduring love affair for all the time that they were a couple. And she was his most influential advisor. He had some fairly close friends in the Senate, I would say. Truman was one of them. I think for a short period of time, Huey Long was one of his senatorial confidants. He got along very well with the La Follette family from Wisconsin. Bob La Follette Sr., and then, of course, who he ran on the progressive ticket for vice president with in 1924, and later with young Bob La Follette. So he was a close confidant with those guys. But in terms of political counsel, I guess, or advice from Montana, I think there were a couple of guys. Barclay Craighead was one who worked on Wheeler's staff for many years and was part of this bipartisan political machine. He had an influential job in a Republican administration in Montana in the early 40s, but he was very much a Wheeler guy. And there was another guy named Burke Clements, who worked for Wheeler in Washington, D.C. and in Montana, and was often kind of the on-the-ground campaign guy. Burke Clements is the one who wrote Wheeler the letter saying, if you can get through the primary, you're going to win the general election with Republican support, but you got to worry about the primary. So I think those two guys were quite instrumental. Also, Ed Craney, the famous broadcaster from Butte, pioneering radio broadcaster and television broadcaster, was a close confidant and political advisor for Wheeler, particularly influential on related to telecommunications policy when radio was really coming in to be a big force, and then shortly on the heels of that, television coming into being. And Ed Craney was very, very influential with BK.
So my impression from your Wheeler book was his interest in national and international issues made him the type of senator who did not bring home the bacon, for example, focusing on public works projects. Erickson used this against him in the 46 primary.
Actually, I think that's a little bit of a misconception. I think Wheeler was good at bringing home the bacon. And two huge irrigation projects he's got his fingerprints all over, Fort Peck Dam being the most obvious one, the biggest New Deal project in Montana, which Wheeler had lobbied Roosevelt personally to authorize. The other is the Buffalo Rapids project in southeastern Montana. Wheeler was influential on the decisions related to hydropower development in the Flathead. So he was, he was focused on that kind of thing. Very supportive of the rail unions that were very important politically and economically in Montana. So I think he did bring home the bacon. He lobbied General Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the United States Army Air Corps, to cite an Air Force base at Great Falls, which we now know as Malmstrom. So he was somebody who did bring home the bacon, but also focused very much on national and international affairs.
Is there a similarity between Wheeler's fight against Roosevelt's court packing and Mansfield's objection to the Vietnam War?
Ooh, that's a good question. A connection between, yeah, I think in a way there is. Wheeler's opposition to Roosevelt's court packing was based on a couple of fairly big principles, I think. One was he believed in the constitutional separation of powers, that you have three co-equal branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and that if Franklin Roosevelt were able to enlarge the Supreme Court, as he proposed to do by increasing it from 9 to 15 members in 1937, that in effect the court would have become subservient to the executive branch. That, and this, we're having this debate again right now. How independent is the court? And Wheeler thought that independent courts were a bedrock of defense of civil liberties. So he was very much concerned about an expansion of presidential power. Mansfield's opposition to Vietnam, a little different case, I think, although I think he really also, deep in his heart, was concerned about too much power being concentrated in the executive branch at the expense of Congress making decisions about American foreign policy. So you remember, if you remember your history, 1964, Johnson gets Congress to authorize what has been known ever after as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, coming out of an attack on American destroyers in the South China Sea. And Johnson uses that Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as the enabling document, if you will, to expand the war in Southeast Asia. And Mansfield, I believe, came to regret that he had gone along with that there had been so little debate in the Senate about the wisdom of US involvement in Southeast Asia. He was a real student of this part of the world. I mean, academically, he was trained as an Asian scholar, but he really made a study of it. He traveled to Southeast Asia early in the 1960s during the Kennedy administration. And he knew a great deal about what was going on in South Vietnam with, as it turned out, he believed, as did others like Frank Church and George McGovern in this period, that it was really a nationalist civil war that was taking place, that the emphasis on communism and South Vietnam falling to communism was misplaced, that this was really a nationalist movement, that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, number one, and a communist secondarily. So Mansfield I think was very concerned about the direction of US foreign policy, and that a strong president, as Johnson clearly was, that he was having too much influence on foreign policy, and that the Senate really needed to continue to assert itself. And by the mid 60s, you're seeing him really, sort of enabling the so-called Senate doves of that period, Church and McGovern and Mark Hatfield from Oregon and others, to begin to, really ramp up their criticism of the war and frankly find ways to end the war. And he was totally supportive of that, again, from the standpoint of understanding that that's the Senate's role. You have to let the Senate work its will, that you have to have debates and you have to reach consensus on things. And he very much was a believer in that. I hope that's responsive to the question.
Okay, well, let's do one more and then we'll have to call it quits, I think. Can you talk about the relationship between Wheeler and Metcalf? I believe your book talks about Metcalf being opposed to Wheeler in the 46th Democratic primary.
The relationship between Lee Metcalf and Burton K. Wheeler, just to jog your memory, Metcalf was a young Democratic operative in the 1930s and 40s, worked as an assistant in the Attorney General's office. He actually won his first statewide election in 1946, that same election where Mansfield withstood the national Republican tide and won re-election to the House. Metcalf was elected to the state Supreme Court as an associate justice in 1946 and subsequently replaced Mansfield in the House when Mansfield went to the Senate. And then when Jim Murray retired in 1960, Metcalf went on to capture the Senate seat. Actually, the Wheeler-Metcalf relationship was pretty strained. In the 1940 presidential campaign, Roosevelt running for a controversial third term, which Wheeler opposed, Metcalf was very much a Roosevelt Democrat, a Montana Democrat for Roosevelt. And Wheeler had his own presidential ambitions in 1940. And they got into a fairly public spat in 1940 over Wheeler's presidential ambitions and whether he was undercutting Roosevelt, et cetera. So they never had much of a relationship after that. And I can't prove this with absolute certainty, but I would be willing to guess that Metcalf was doing all he could to aid Leif Erikson's candidacy against Wheeler in 1946. I remember talking to Mansfield, and I asked him about a number of Montana political figures from his era, including Lee Metcalf, and he said, and he almost became a little bit emotional, a little bit misty-eyed when he talked about Metcalf. He said, you know, he always labored in my shadow, and that was really unfair to him because he had such an accomplished career himself, arguably one of the great environmental conservationist legislators of the 20th century, and you know, a real record of accomplishment. And Mansfield said he always labored in my shadow, and he considered Lee Metcalf one of the truly great characters of Montana political history, along with Tom Walsh, Wheeler, Jeanette Rankin, and Jim Murray. He placed himself 5th or 6th on the list when I challenged him with his ranking. I said, Senator, you were the longest serving majority leader in Senate history and a 4-term senator, and went on to be ambassador to Japan under Republican and Democratic presidents. And you're putting yourself at 5th or 6th on the list of all-time great figures. And he said, well, you asked me for my ranking. That's my ranking.
Okay, one final quick question. Have you ever thought about running for office on the state or national level?
Oh my God, no. I'm happily married and my wife would leave me, so.
Great.
Oh, I think anybody who reports on politics, as I did for many years, or who loves political history, as I do, and has tried to write political history, of course you think about, you know, could I do that job, et cetera, but it's never been more than a fleeting fantasy, and I usually lay down, put a cold compress on my forehead, and it passes fairly quickly.
Well, great. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. We've used up quite a bit of your time, but this was just great. And we really do appreciate your sharing this with us.
Well, I enjoyed it immensely.